Hi everyone, so we're going to talk to you about a project carried out for the Good Homes Alliance on early stage guidance for overheating. It's got a number of sponsors, thank you if you're here today. And this session is really about the overview of the project, what we're trying to do and where we're at. And if you're interested in the details of the pilot tool, you can come at a lunchtime workshop where you can actually test the projects and see where we got to. The objectives of the projects are really to help project teams and in particular local authorities at the very early stages of design, potentially when there's only a sketch, to assess whether there are any big risk factors for overheating in residential developments. And it is focused on new build. What we're trying to do, essentially, is bridge a gap between, I'm sorry I can't move with this mic, but bridge a gap between the existing guidance, which is quite high level for policy making and plan development, and the other end, which is very much about detailed design, where there are already quite a few tools, and obviously the HHSRS in occupied dwellings. So we're trying to go in between at the early stage where you might not have enough design information to do detailed calcs. And our target audience are people who are not necessarily technical experts, so not necessarily the engineers and modelers, but ideally a case officer who just want to check whether the scheme looks about right. To pick up on what Richard said, we're also trying to consider factors that are typically not included in the current tools because of methodology or because of software reasons. And in particular, the site context, so noise, local greenery, and how that might influence your capacity to dissipate heat. That is typically not included in the tools, or it really relies on the modeler or people who use the calcs to know what they're doing. So where we're at is the last stage. We have done some background review of the literature. We have done some surveys of stakeholders, which we'll tell you about. And we have a pilot tool. We're literally showing it for the first time today. So do come to our workshop if you want to see it. The background research we did was both in terms of the policy background and the actual technical research available. There's no doubt that the policy background is mounting that not only Partel will address it better, but I'm sure you've all heard last week about the report by the Committee on Climate Change, who said that houses needed to be future-proof. Overheating is much more mentioned in the new NPPF. So people are talking more about it, but there's still quite a gap in what guidance is actually available. In terms of the literature, we reviewed all sorts of information about risk factors for overheating and possible mitigation measures. To be quite honest, I would still recommend going to the Zero Carbon Hub reports on overheating. They're still very, very comprehensive. There's loads of sources of information. And there is more literature since that we have looked at, but this is still a very, very good starting point. What we have found is that there is loads of information about a long list of factors that lead to overheating risk. What we haven't found is which ones matter most, or someone ready to say, actually, these ones matter more. And this is the risk factor that we're going to attribute to it compared to that other one that matters less. So this has been a lot of our work, and this is one of the things we want to test with you. There's also areas of development where people are looking more and more at things like heat risk mapping, the impact of green infrastructure. So it's very exciting, and it goes into an urban planning context, which we are trying to acknowledge in our tool. What we also did were surveys to designers and local authorities to see how people currently practice. How do they assess overheating risk? What do they need, if they even need anything else? And we've had about 200 responses, which is pretty exciting, 150 designers and about 50 from local authorities, from quite a range of disciplines. As you can see on the left-hand side, architects, engineers, acoustic specialists, And on the right-hand side, from local authorities, we've had, again, a good mix of people from the planning, building control, and environmental health departments, which is really great because it means we capture all the stages of a building cycle. What they're telling us, the local authorities, we asked them, well, who in your local authority leads on overheating risk assessments? And the largest pie slice that you can see is no one. I'll just pause on that. And then about a mix of discipline, people tended to think that either it was someone else or it's them and they're doing it very well. And then we also asked what tools they ask and how often they ask people to use the tools. The green bars on the right-hand side is never. So the majority of local authorities just don't use these tools very much. The one that is most used is SAP, which, as we all know, has limitations in assessing overheating risk. We also dug a bit deeper into how well people understand the tools that are out there. So on the left-hand side is responses by designers, on the right by local authorities. It's really annoying without being able to move. I don't know if you can see the pointer, but basically, across designers, there's a majority of designers that are very aware of tools such as SAP, PHPP from Passive House, and TM59 dynamic modeling. Quite a lot less the BRE tool from the Home Quality Mark. And they understand them reasonably well. These are the green proportions of these bars. On the right-hand side, local authorities clearly have much lower levels of awareness. That's bearing in mind that there were a lot of building control respondents in our surveys, and very clearly also lower levels of understandings of the tool. So they don't know them much, and they're not too sure how to use them, which had really confirmed the approach we wanted to take, which is something quite simple to use that they would be able to learn to use quite quickly. And this is another plea for training of local authorities. I'm looking at MHCLG here. We also asked what sort of tool they wanted. People do not want a spreadsheet. They want a flow chart or a checklist. So this is the way we're going.
We got very clear guidance that what was required was a simple-to-use tool that was going to reinforce people's common sense, as Richard said earlier, and would be very quick to make use of. So the idea being that this tool, it's never going to be perfect. It's never going to give you an exact idea of what your overheating risk might be, but it will give you a flavour of where it's coming from, and whether it's of a low, probably don't need to worry about it. A medium, you probably do need to think about what kind of mitigations you're going to factor into the design to make sure that it doesn't become a big problem. Or high, you're really going to have to go back and have a think about this some more. You're going to make some changes, and you probably need some modelling to make sure that what the changes you're making are enough to mitigate the risk that's been seen. So the idea being that we'll have a very simple one-page tool that will be a checklist. It'll be a series of questions that you'll score on any particular scheme, and within that you'll need to be a bit mindful about thinking about which units might be a worst case in terms of these questions and what the general answers would be for the scheme. But for each individual question, for instance, the example we've got up here is about albedo. So we know that site albedo does have an influence. And when a site is surrounded by very dark coloured hard surfaces, that heat is absorbed and those surfaces re-radiate, and that can generate a microclimate, raise the microclimate around, and mean that air coming in through windows, particularly across those dark coloured facades, is warmer than it would otherwise be. So the tool will have that question. It'll give a quick overview of why that is an issue in overheating terms. It'll also give some illustrations and some background information where you can find more information about that issue, and give some guidance on how to score that particular question if there's any doubt on that. And then links to further references and materials should you wish to understand that in more detail. So that's the pattern we're following for each question. This is roughly what it's going to look like. We do have a workshop this lunchtime where we will be handing out copies and looking for feedback. So if you're interested in the specifics of the tool and how it's going to function, we would really welcome you to come along and have a look at it in more detail and give us some feedback on how you think it performs, or what do you think it looks like, whether we've got all the right questions. Encouragingly, I think most of the risks that Richard talked about on the previous session, we have included in the questions. I think it's 15 questions, so it should only take 5-10 minutes to fill in on a form and give you a flavour of where the overheating risk level is on that project. So we're taking into account some things that, in fact, the detailed modelling can't take into account, such as albedo and such as some of the microclimate issues. And we're trying to balance those out. So on the one side, we've got the risk factors, which are the column in red on the left. And on the other side are mitigation factors that might improve the overheating risk scenario. So, building in a very green environment or next to a body of water, for instance, can be very beneficial, can improve that microclimate. Having very large openable windows or really good shading can also mitigate for having large areas of glass. So these things are all trying to balance against each other. And at the bottom we have a score for all the risk factors and a score for all the mitigation factors. We minus the mitigations from the risk and you're left with a final product. And that number we assess along the bottom scale to give you, and it's clear it's a spectrum rather than an absolute kind of pass-fail threshold. And that should give you a sort of low, medium and high kind of flavour for where the project sits. So the idea being that this will sit in a place where it's trying to encourage that early stage feeling, that intuition, that common sense early on for what the risk factors are and how strongly they're balanced against each other. And what it will lead you towards is understanding when you need to do more detailed analysis, so when there's a requirement for a more detailed model. So we don't want to prescribe modelling on all projects. It's an expensive exercise, or can be. We want to only channel the modelling into the scenarios where we feel there's a significant enough risk to be worth exploring and to understand the mitigations and balance them out. Have I missed something out on that slide? So well, it's on the slide. Common sense checks, and we've tested it against. So the purpose of this slide is that with the way we've tested the tool as it is, and the way we've finalised the scorings and the different rankings that we've used, are partly through a series of common sense rules of thumb, and also through a series of actually testing it against projects that we know about and we have some sense of the overheating risk on them. So they're either projects that are post-occupancy and we have feedback from how they're actually used and how they're actually performing, or they're projects where we've done some quite detailed modelling and we have an understanding of what the modelling suggests about the overheating risk on those projects. And we've used those to validate the scoring that we've put into the tool. But we are very clear, we're trying to do the whole country and judge a lot of different risks, and it is a very dynamic situation, overheating, and that's why we have the modelling tools. So this will never be absolutely perfect. We don't want to give that impression. It is a reckoner. So these are we've done quite a number of archetypes of common sense testing as well, where we've looked at units. We've invented units in scenarios where we feel that the overheating risk should be generally pretty low. And we've also looked at units in scenarios where we know there is usually quite a significant overheating problem. And we've used those as well to push them through the scheme and make sure that we're comfortable with how those then score. So, if you want to come and have a look, the workshop is at 1:30 at the Knowledge Forum. We'd really welcome you to come along. I've got a whole load of printouts of the tool as it is, the draft, and we'd be really pleased to have some feedback on what you think of it.